Morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. Nice to see you. Nice to be in Nashville, as I am a huge country music fan. And, my fondest memories as a child were sitting beside my grandfather, listening to him play the fiddle. My dad was an entertainer. Uncle was an entertainer. So when I retired from hockey, I started writing and singing. And so we're looking forward to our tour coming up in March. But, it's hard to believe that 11 years ago, I had a fully loaded pistol in my mouth ready to pull the trigger. And you're probably wondering, how does a world junior champion, Olympic gold medalist, Stanley Cup winner, I'm the 60th all-time leading scorer in the National Hockey League. Thank you. The All-Star game was here a couple days ago. I played in 7 of those. And so, I'm sure you're probably wondering, how does a guy like that, end up with a gun in his mouth? Well, I grew up in a very volatile, chaotic home where both my parents suffered childhood trauma in their life, and they turned to addictions to deal with their own personal childhood trauma. And so, I grew up, dad was alcoholic and my mom was a prescription pill addict. And so, I saw a tremendous amount of chaos in my childhood. And because I was the oldest in my family, a lot of times I had the referee jersey on and was keeping my parents from, hurting each other. And so I was living in a little town in Manitoba, which is in the middle of Canada, in a place called Binscarth, population 300 people. And I was walking home with one of my classmates from kindergarten. And it was about November, and so it was a nice Canadian spring day, about minus 40, with the wind chill minus 1,000. And he said to me, he says, "Hey, we're having our first hockey practice tonight. Would you like to play?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." So I ran home, and I asked my mom if I had any equipment, and so we searched around the house, and I found an old pair of skates, broken hockey sticks, some old gloves, a couple of Sears catalogs I used for shin pads, and I put all this stuff in a pillowcase. And probably not a lot of you have read my first book, Playing with Fire, but the very first picture in Playing with Fire is me in my skidoo suit with my pillow sack over, going to my first hockey practice. And the most incredible thing about that picture is that I was completely alone, right? I'm going to my first hockey practice ever in my life, and my parents, not there. And so I went to this first hockey practice, and the rink in that town was an old converted barn that they turned into a rink. And, like most of us that try something new for the first time, it takes dedication, hard work, et cetera, et cetera. And that day, I put on all the equipment, I stepped on the ice, I didn't fall down, I didn't struggle, and I absolutely fell head over heels in love with the game of hockey. And, hockey in my life has probably been the one constant thing that made sense, right? Because when I stepped on the ice, my brain chemistry was completely perfect and normal, right? It was completely perfect and normal. Because everything I wasn't getting at home, when I went to the rink, I got it. Love, respect, caring, team, community, all these amazing things that I wasn't getting at home. Because, for example, when my dad came home from work, he sat in his big chair and watched TV and was completely comatose. Was not a part of the world, was not a part of reality. And my mom, because she was depressed and anxious and all these things, she was sleeping all the time. So basically, me and my two brothers, we raised each other. And every major decision that I've ever made in my life, I've made it from the time I was 5 years old until now. And I didn't realize at the time that this type of parenting would affect me as an adult. And not only that, I had dreams and aspirations of playing in the NHL from the time I was, stepped on the ice. And I happened to run into a coach who could help me get to where I needed to go. And so I left home when I was 15 years old, and I moved to Winnipeg, a big center there, with this coach. And needless to say, that decision would change me, for the rest of my life. Because over the next 2.5 years, this coach raped me 150 times in a 2.5 year period. And so what I was left with was a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, and a lot of anger. Anger. And so it wasn't too long after that I discovered this wonderful substance, medicine, called alcohol. Right? Because trauma, addictions, and mental health all live in the same house. They all live in the same house. Okay? And, from the time I took my first sip of alcohol, I became an instant alcoholic. Okay? And, still was able to go on and have this amazing hockey career, despite the fact that I was a very high-functioning alcoholic, drug addict, you name it. And that sort of led to that scene in the desert 11 years ago with me having the gun in my mouth. And it wasn't that I wanted to die. It was because I was completely exhausted from living in emotional pain and scars. And that scene in the desert in Santa Fe, New Mexico, because that's where I was living at the time, started me on the path of healing and recovery. And so in 2003, I retired from hockey. I had 1 year left on a deal with the Chicago Blackhawks for $4.5 million. And I was running on the treadmill, and there was a mirror right in front of me. And halfway through the workout, I pressed stop on the treadmill, and I said, that's it, I'm done. This isn't fun anymore. I'm not enjoying myself. And, I'd hurt a lot of people along the way with my behavior and my addictions, coaches, teammates, and I was tired of looking them in the eye and seeing, the sadness and the, their loss for words at how to sort of, get me out of the situation that I was in. And so shortly after that, I moved back to Calgary, and I ran into a friend who had covered me in the media for many, many years when I was a member of the Calgary Flames. And he said to me, he says, what are you doing? I said, I'm doing absolutely nothing, And so the conversation went back and forth, and I said to him, do you know anybody that would be interested in writing a book with me? He says, funny you should ask. He goes, my wife is a writer. So I said, okay, set up the meeting. And so I met with her 3 days later, and 3 days later after that, I started writing Playing with Fire, where I was a little reluctant at the beginning to tell my whole complete story. But the lady I wrote the book with is a very famous Hollywood reporter, and she has interviewed the biggest stars in the world: Schwarzenegger, Cruise, Demi Moore, Bruce, all these people, right? So she's very good at what she does. And so here I am. The book is finished, and we're set to go on a national-wide book tour with this book called Playing with Fire. So 4 days before I was about to depart for Toronto, I was literally crapping in my pants going, what have I just done? You know? And I didn't really have any expectations other than I wanted to put all this stuff on paper, take one last look at it, and put it in its rightful place, which is the past. But we all know you can't do that, right? You can't, the past will always keep coming back if you don't deal with it. And I was pretty raw at the time. And so the first book signing was in Toronto, downtown Toronto, biggest Chapters Indigo's store in Canada. And like I said, I didn't have any expectations. I show up, 400 people show up at this book signing. I'm like, this is weird. I'm the 60th all-time leading scorer in the NHL. I'm not Wayne Gretzky, And so I started to sign books. Out of the corner of my eye, I spot this guy in line. He's got my book clutched against his chest. His face is buried in the floor, and he's walking really slow. So I followed him all the way in the line. He gets to the front of the line, sets the book on the table, looks me in the eye and says, "Me too. Me too. Me too." And so right then and there, I found the purpose for my life. Because it took an incredible amount of courage for that man to get himself to that book signing to relay the message that I needed to hear. And so 1 became 10. 10 became 1,000. 1,000 became 10,000. 10,000 became 100,000. 100,000 became 250,000. 250,000 became 500,000 Me Too's since that first Me Too. And that was in 2009, and I'm sure it's well over that figure right now. So 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys before the age of 18 will be sexually abused. Okay? The Boy Scouts of America hid 5,200 pedophiles. And by the time each pedophile gets caught, he has at least 125 victims, which means there were 600,000 boys abused in the Boy Scouts of America. Right? Stats don't lie. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've heard it with these ears. Every single day, somebody says those 2 words to me: me too. Me too. Me too. And I don't like the word sexual abuse because it's rape. The word is rape. Some smart aleck lawyer came up with the phrase sexual abuse so that he could get his client a lesser charge. And in Canada, we don't have a justice system. It's called the injustice system. And so I've spent the last 9 years going across Canada, back and forth, speaking about my experience with trauma, because I call it trauma. It's a little nicer word. So I go across the country talking about my experience with trauma. And trauma is the biggest epidemic we have on the planet. Childhood trauma is the biggest epidemic on the planet. 1 out of every 3 people that walk the face of the earth have suffered some sort of childhood traumatic experience, which leaves us with emotional pain, scars, suffering, etc., which then gravitates us towards all kinds of addictive behaviors. I'm not talking alcohol and drugs. Yeah, that's workaholism, sexual addiction, gambling addiction, food addiction, you name it. I belong to all the A groups, all the 12-step A groups, I belong to all of them. And so, how do we go from that to this? How do we do that? Well, there's a word that I like to use called spirituality. Spirituality. Because when we're abused, that's what happens. Our spirit gets taken away from us, and the way back to self is finding that spirit again. And I have found my spirit in the Aboriginal and Indigenous community, because I'm an Aboriginal person. I'm Métis. I got mixed. I'm French and Native. And I've been to 140 First Nations communities in Canada talking about my experience. And while I've been on these communities, I've taken the cotton out of my ears and put it in my mouth, and I started to listen to what the elders had to say. And I believe in my heart of hearts that the Aboriginal community does spirituality better than any group on the planet. Because it's simple. Because it's individual. It's individual. My spirituality is different than yours, but I don't care. I don't care what your spirituality is or your religion is or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. And so I found a lot of healing in that community. A lot of healing in that community. And it's been an absolutely the most incredible journey that a person could ever go on, is the one where for the first time in my life I actually have a relationship with myself. Right? I have a relationship with myself. I love myself. I like myself. I like who I am. And if you're looking for answers, they're not going to come from here, out here. They're going to come from here. They're going to come from here. And to me, spirituality, true spirituality, is all about relationship. Right? Because if I love myself and I get into a relationship, then I have an opportunity to love somebody else. But if I don't love myself, how can I possibly have a relationship with somebody else? Right? Did you know when we meet people, we don't meet them in the present because we carry this big aura around us. And so my trauma meets with the girl that I'm with's trauma. And so now I'm in my 4th relationship, serious relationship in my life. Right? Ooh, that got everybody quiet. But it's true. It's very true. So spirituality is huge for me in my personal recovery. And helping other people who've had a similar experience such as mine. We have a saying, helping is healing. Go figure. 3 words. Helping is healing. And healing is possible. Healing is possible. Depending on how far you want to dig deep within yourself to find those answers of why do I do the things that I do. So for example, I met this neuroscientist along my travels speaking. And I was very attracted to her brain. And so she came to my house for the weekend, and we sat around my kitchen table, and she explained the science of my trauma. And we sat around the kitchen table for 72 hours and talked about the science of trauma and how it affected my brain. At the end of the 72 hours, I realized there wasn't one thing I could have changed about my life to make it any different. And so we peeled all of the layers of the onion off. I got to the core of what my issues were. Abandonment and neglect. Not good enough. Not lovable. Anybody relate to that? You're lying. You're lying. So now that I'm an adult, I can make choices, I can change, I can do different things so that I feel different. You know, every argument I ever had in a relationship as an adult, I felt that person was going to abandon me, which made me feel not lovable, not good enough, you know. And so why do you think I had this amazing hockey career? I'm the shortest guy to ever play in the NHL. Shortest guy to score 50 goals in one season. Why do you think that was? Because I wasn't good enough. And so I just drove myself harder and harder and harder and harder, right? Because I didn't feel good enough. And I was looking for other people to fill that big hole inside of me, instead of me filling the hole myself. And so, I got a couple minutes left here. So I want you to think about trauma. Because, you know, we're living in a world right now where there's a lot of angry people. You know? There's always a reason for somebody's behavior. And that behavior was learned in childhood. So Ray Rice punching his wife in an elevator, we all look at it like, ooh, you know, it's very uncomfortable. What do you think Ray Rice saw when he was growing up as a kid? That's all he saw. And so in a split-second decision, he made the wrong choice. Yes, he has to pay for that. But compassion, 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 right? The Dalai Lama, who's the king of compassion, you know what he says every day? I need to learn to be more compassionate. What does that say to us? There's always a reason for the behavior, and that behavior was learned in childhood. And that's trauma. And trauma comes in all shapes, sizes, forms, you name it. So if we have this wonderful chemical in our brain called oxytocin. It's the most powerful drug on the planet, right? And the pharmaceutical companies have, you know, altered it and made it into a synthetic form. But that's what we need to do, is we need to love. We need to care for one another. We need to be compassionate to one another. And that's how we're going to get out of this. That's how we're going to get out of this. Because the greatest thing that I get to do on a daily basis is I get to watch somebody get rid of their shame that they've been carrying around for many, many years in a matter of 5 to 10 minute conversation. And what comes from them telling their own story is empowerment. Empowerment. So your story is every bit as important as my story, because some way, somewhere, somehow, you're going to be in a situation and you're going to say or tell somebody something that you've never told anybody in your life. And they're going to go, oh my God, that happened to you? Oh, that happened to me too. And now they don't feel alone anymore. And now it gives them permission to tell their story. You know? And one of the greatest reveals that I ever had was I was in Calgary and I was speaking to a group of 60 people. And after I was done speaking, this gentleman stood over to the side and waited till all the people came up and thanked me, met me, whatever. So he comes up, he stands in front of me, looks exactly like Santa Claus. I swear to God, he looks exactly like Santa Claus. And he's standing in front of me, and he's really nervous, and he's shaking, and he said, "My name is so-and-so, and I was abused for 705 consecutive days, and I'm 80 years old, and you're the first person I've ever told in my life." So if I can do it, you can be that person too, to hear that story, because that reveal is what is going to get those people on the path of healing. On the path of healing. So I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. I love Nashville. I love country music, and my album's on iTunes. It's called I Am Who I Am. You can go and download it. It's got some great stuff on there. And so, thank you. Have a wonderful day.